Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for another poetry discussion, which will take place in two separate playlists here on the channel. I cannot get rid of this cold. Number one, the poetry discussion playlist. Number two, the Charles Bukowski playlist, a playlist of partially poetry discussions, but also video essays and whatnot about the late, great Charles Bukowski. The poem in question today is known as the Sparrow, and it reads as such. To give life, you must take life. And as our grief falls flat and hollow upon the billion-blooded sea, I pass upon serious inward breaking shoals rimmed with white-legged, white-bellied, rotting creatures lengthily dead and rioting against surrounding scenes. Dear child, I only did to you what the sparrow did to you. I am old when it is fashionable to be young. I cry when it is fashionable to laugh. I hated you when it would have taken less courage to love. So there is obviously question as to whom this poem is directed toward. That answer may greatly and drastically change the poem. Bukowski was a father. This poem includes the line, Dear child. If this poem is indeed directed towards Bukowski's child, it becomes very different very quick. It becomes something much less interesting, but likewise much more literal. In that, yeah, it would have taken a lot of courage to hate your own child and very little courage to love your child. I'm going to take it in a different direction than that because I think it's more interesting to take it in a different direction than that because the universality of poetry, etc. So, this opening line here, to give life, you must take life. Obviously, that is not true. Obviously, that is not a reflection on reality. Obviously, that is not a one-for-one translation of the world into literature. You do not have to kill, for example, your wife to get a daughter. That's not what goes on. But is this true on an energetic sense? So, I am of the age now where many of the people my age are starting to have their children leave the house. If they had children at 20, etc., those kids are going to college. And you hear people in that case talk about what it's like to suddenly have their life back. They had children all this time. They had someone to whom their entirety was dedicated. Suddenly, they have their life back. They essentially gave their life to raise, to foster another life. This is something that is obviously reductive, right? This interpretation of things is reductive. Obviously, if there are two people, they can have 4 children and don't have to go -2 lives into debt. But there is something to be said for the non-literal interpretation of that line. To give life, you must take life. And I also don't believe that this is a translation of Bukowski saying, okay, to live, you have to eat, you have to kill, whether you're vegetarian or not. I think, especially with the direction that this poem goes, that this is simply a translation of the energy that goes into fostering someone else, not even necessarily a child. Your relationships, your friendships, every bit that you give to someone else, necessarily takes something from you, that something being time. Now, some people are much better at giving and receiving energy back, right? And I hate to get hippy dippy, I hate to get weird in these conversations, but there are other people that interacting with individuals, being a friend, being a boyfriend, being a girlfriend, being there for someone, withdraws from that person. That person is more solitary. That person loses energy from being around people rather than gains energy. Though there are social people who feel energized the more time they spend with other people. This is not true for everyone, but even those people for whom this is true, that they do get energy from spending time with other people, those people as well are losing the time invested with other people. Or their dog, their hamster, Larry, whatever it is that they're fostering. Which leads us to that next little bit there. I pass upon inward breaking shoals rimmed with white-legged, white-bellied, rotting creatures lengthily dead and rioting against surrounding scenes. This idea of being dead as an act of rebellion is very, very interesting. Being dead as an act of rebellion suggests that the sort of mainstream is to be alive. Now, being alive certainly it helps create the mainstream, but simply being alive, there are a lot of forms of being alive. Being alive, being the accepted state, is certainly something that society would promote. The idea of rebellion in the very act of death is, I think, reflective of a deeper state of our speaker. This is that 16-year-old angst that says, screw him, I'm going to go on a walk and never come home. This is that type of angst. This is that type of emotion. This is that type of an outburst, simply aged 50 years and written in poetic form. That is part of why Bukowski has lived so long, ironically, for this type of line, this type of sentiment. But I think that on a grander scale, look, what I often talk about with Bukowski is that one of the really compelling things about his poetry is that Bukowski's speaker invites us into the poem and invites us into the poem to judge the speaker, not to judge the subject. Lines like, I hated you when it would have taken less courage to love. It's not a very nice guy thing to do, right? That is not a very supportable line, especially if this is directed to dear child, my child, as the speaker would state perhaps. So often Bukowski invites us into the poem to judge the speaker directly. Invites us into the poem, the speaker sort of elbowing us along the way, while we understand that speaker's the dirtbag. Which, this being such an in your face cry for solitude, right? Come here. I have to tell you, I want you to leave me alone, right? That's kind of what this poem is. Does that make it a cry for help? Does this poem come across as a destitute cry for help from a speaker that does not know how to ask for help? One of the more sort of enlightening and popular and lighthearted Bukowski poems, if you can call it that, is Bluebird. There's a bluebird in my heart, but I pour whiskey on him. I inhale cigar smoke to shut him up, right? The conclusion of the poem, of course, being, I pull him out and I tell him, look, I know you're in there, so don't lose hope quite yet. Is this poem a reflection of a speaker who has let that bluebird die? Obviously, you have to credit Bukowski with the self-awareness necessary to write a poem like that, as opposed to just have a bleeding heart on the page that is completely oblivious to any type of signaling that might be going on. If this poem is in fact a cry for help, you have to understand that Bukowski probably would have known it. But despair seems to care little for the appraisal of others. If this poem is coming from a place of despair, maybe the authorial voice cares so little about whether or not that idea gets across that our writer would be willing to use our speaker for such a bald-faced cry for help. It is an interesting dynamic. It is something that I don't think we necessarily are faced with very often in literature writ large, or in poetry for that matter either. If this is just a cry for help, wow, right? We have such a contentious statement here. I hated you when it would have taken less courage to love. Death as an act of rebellion. To take life, the most wonderful thing in existence. To give life, the most wonderful thing in existence. You have to take life. Take the most wonderful thing in existence. Very bleak. Very troubling. Maybe that is exactly what is meant by it. That is all I have for this poem, for this poetry discussion. If you like or appreciate what I do on the channel, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers, with other Bukowski lovers. There's poetry on the channel every Monday, so consider hitting the subscribe button to stick around for more literature in the future. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.